Malik Carter had been waiting for this day for months. Every morning before school and every late afternoon after his shift at the coffee shop, he had counted the dollars and tucked them away safely, watching his savings grow little by little. It had taken patience, more than a few sacrifices, and a whole lot of discipline for a 17-year-old, but today made it all worth it. Today, he was finally going to buy the bracelet. It wasn't just any bracelet. It was the one he had seen months ago through the display window of Baxter Jewelers, the most expensive jewelry store in town. A delicate silver chain with tiny charms, each shaped like a little star. Simple, elegant, and just the kind of thing his little sister, Maya, would love. Malik could already picture the way her eyes would light up, the way she'd gasp before breaking into that big, dimpled smile of hers. He'd been the one to pick her up from school every day since she was old enough to walk home, and every single day she had greeted him with that same smile. This bracelet, it was his way of saying thank you, of showing her how much he loved her, how much she meant to him. The day was warm, the kind of early spring afternoon where the air was crisp and the golden sun painted soft patterns on the sidewalk. People bustled around the small downtown district of Riverton, moving from the cafe to the bookstore, from the tailor's shop to the flower stand on the corner. The air smelled of fresh bread from the bakery across the street, mixing with the faint perfume of tulips and lilies from the florist. It was one of those afternoons that made life feel easy, simple. Malik should have felt the same way, light, carefree. But instead, as he walked toward Baxter Jewelers, he felt something heavy sitting in his chest. Not quite fear, not quite worry, but something close. He knew why. Even before stepping through the doors, even before touching the cool metal of the handle, he could already feel the weight of the stairs. He had been here before, not inside the store, but in moments just like this one. The feeling was familiar, the way people's eyes flicked toward him, how their gazes lingered a little too long before quickly looking away. He had seen it at the grocery store when an older woman clutched her purse tighter as he walked past. He had seen it at the gas station, where the cashier always seemed to watch him more closely than the other customers. He adjusted his hoodie, not because he was cold, but because he knew how people looked at young black men in hoodies. He had heard the warnings from his mother 1,000 times before. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly. Don't give anyone a reason to be afraid of you, even if you've done nothing wrong. But today, he wasn't going to let any of that stop him. Malik took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped inside the store. A small bell chimed above the door, a soft, delicate sound that barely broke the silence inside. The store was just as he had imagined, polished glass cases, neatly arranged jewelry on velvet displays, bright lights reflecting off rows of silver and gold. The scent of something expensive lingered in the air, like leather and polished wood. He didn't belong here. The thought came so quickly that it startled him. No. He shook it off. He did belong here. He had worked for this, saved for this. He had every right to be in this store, just like any other customer. Still, he couldn't ignore the way the room shifted when he walked in. A woman behind the counter, a middle-aged lady with perfectly styled blonde hair and sharp blue eyes, lifted her gaze. For a brief second, her expression was neutral, almost bored, but then she saw him. And in that instant, something in her changed. Her eyes narrowed. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She stiffened ever so slightly. Malik had seen that look before. He swallowed, forcing himself to push forward. He didn't want to assume the worst, didn't want to let old fears ruin this moment. With careful steps, he approached the glass case where the bracelet sat, still in the same spot as when he had first seen it weeks ago. It shimmered under the light, delicate and perfect, just waiting for him to take it home. "Excuse me," Malik said, keeping his voice calm, steady, the way his mother had taught him. "I'd like to see that bracelet, please." The woman, Linda Baxter, as the gold nameplate on her blouse read, tilted her head slightly, still watching him, assessing him. She didn't move. "That one?" she asked, her tone light but carrying something sharp underneath. Malik nodded, offering a polite smile. "Yes, please." Linda hesitated, then finally stepped forward, but instead of reaching for the bracelet, she folded her arms. "It's quite expensive," she said. Malik's jaw tightened. He had expected this. He had hoped he was wrong, but he wasn't. "I know," he said, pulling his wallet from his pocket. He opened it, showing the neatly folded bills inside. "I've been saving up for it." Linda's gaze flicked to the cash, then back to his face. She still didn't move. "That's a lot of money for someone your age," she said, her voice casual, but there was an edge to it. "Where did you get it?" Malik felt his stomach turn, heat creeping up his neck. He forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. "I work at Parker's Coffee House," he said, keeping his voice even. "I've been saving for months." Linda let out a small, amused scoff, shaking her head slightly. She still hadn't moved toward the bracelet. Malik could feel it now, the weight of her suspicion, thick and unspoken. "I'd still like to see the bracelet," he said, firmer this time. Linda let out a sigh, long and exaggerated, like he was inconveniencing her. Then, finally, she turned and pulled out the velvet tray, setting it on the counter with a little too much force. "Be careful with it," she said, her tone sharp. "It's worth more than what you probably make in a year." Malik's fingers twitched. He wanted to say something, wanted to push back against the insult, against the assumption, but he didn't. Instead, he reached out, carefully picking up the bracelet, feeling the cool silver against his skin. It was perfect. Then, just as he turned it slightly, admiring the way the tiny charms dangled, it slipped. Time seemed to slow as the bracelet tumbled through the air, landing with a soft clink against the glass counter before bouncing off onto the tiled floor below. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, Linda's sharp, piercing voice sliced through the quiet like a blade. "Oh my God! I knew it!" Malik's heart dropped. He barely had time to breathe before Linda's voice rose in alarm, louder this time. "I knew you were up to something. You were trying to steal it, weren't you?" Malik's pulse hammered against his ribs. "No, I..." But before he could finish his sentence, Linda was already reaching for the store phone. "Get the police here." Now, she barked into the receiver. "We've got a thief." Malik stood frozen, the weight of her words slamming into him. All he had wanted to do was buy a bracelet for his sister. But now, standing in the middle of the store, surrounded by watchful, judging eyes, all he could think about was his mother's warning. And the sound of sirens in the distance. The bracelet lay on the cold tile floor, small and delicate, but its fall had set off a storm that Malik never saw coming. Linda Baxter's voice rang out, sharp and accusing, cutting through the air like a blade. "Oh my God! I knew it! You were trying to steal it, weren't you?" Malik's stomach dropped. He felt the weight of her words slam into him, the same way a powerful wave crashes into the shore, unexpected and violent. "No, he started, his voice stumbling over itself, but Linda didn't let him finish. Her hand shot out, grabbing the store phone, her fingers jabbing the buttons with urgency. "Get the police here." Now, she barked into the receiver. "We've got a thief. Young black male, wearing a hoodie. Tried to steal jewelry right off the counter." Malik's breath caught in his chest. The store had fallen silent, but the tension in the air was deafening. He could feel their eyes on him, the other customers, the employees who had been busy polishing the glass cases just moments ago. He didn't have to turn his head to know they were staring. He could sense it, the shift in the room, the way the atmosphere had thickened into something heavy, unmovable. A woman in a tan coat clutched her purse a little tighter. An older man in a dark suit shook his head, muttering something under his breath. The worst part? No one, not a single person, spoke up. They had seen what had happened. They had seen the bracelet slip from his fingers, just an accident, nothing more. And yet, no one came to his defense. Malik felt his hands tremble, but he forced them to stay still. His mother had always told him to be careful, always warned him to keep his cool, to never give anyone a reason to say he was a threat. But how do you stay calm when you're being accused of something you didn't do? Linda was still on the phone, her voice filled with urgency. Yes, I'm sure. He's still in the store. No, he hasn't left yet. But hurry, he's getting aggressive. Aggressive? Malik hadn't moved. Hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't stepped forward. And yet, the way she said it, so sure, so certain, he knew the people in the store believed her. He could see it in their faces. It didn't matter that he was standing still. That his hands were at his sides. That all he wanted was to buy something for his little sister. In their eyes, he was already guilty. Malik swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in his throat. Think. 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 His mother's voice echoed in his head. Keep your hands where people can see them. Stay calm. Do not run. Run? For the first time, the thought crept into his mind. He could leave. Get out of here before the cops arrived, before this turned into something worse. He could walk out the door and disappear down the street, blend into the crowd. But he knew better. He had seen what happened to kids who ran. And besides, why should he run when he had done nothing wrong? Slowly, he bent down and picked up the bracelet, careful, so careful, to keep his movements slow, deliberate. He placed it gently back on the counter. Linda recoiled like he had tossed a rattlesnake at her feet. Don't touch anything else, she snapped. Step away from the counter. Her voice had a sharpness to it, a kind of authority that made people listen, even if what she was saying wasn't true. Malik stepped back, raising his hand slightly, not in surrender, but to show her, to show everyone, that he wasn't a threat. I didn't steal anything, he said, his voice firm but steady. Linda let out a scoff, shaking her head. Oh, please. I've seen your kind before. You walk in here, pretend to be a customer, and the moment I turn my back, you help yourself. Malik's chest tightened. Your kind. She had said it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like she didn't even hear the ugliness of the words as they left her mouth. A flicker of heat rose in his throat, but he forced it down. Getting angry wouldn't help. I came in here to buy the bracelet, he said slowly. I saved up for it. Linda folded her arms across her chest, her sharp blue eyes scanning him with something like disgust. You expect me to believe that? Malik pulled out his wallet again, opened it, showing her the cash. Bills, neatly folded. Money he had worked for, money he had earned. I don't care how much money you have, Linda said, waving her hand dismissively. That doesn't mean you didn't come in here looking to steal. A rush of frustration swelled in Malik's chest, pressing against his ribs, making it harder to breathe. Why was she so determined to see him as a criminal? Why couldn't she see him as just another customer? Just another kid buying something for his little sister? The sirens pierced the quiet before he could say anything else. Loud. Sharp. The sound made Malik's whole body go rigid, like his bones had turned to stone. The police were here. His fingers twitched at his sides. Even though he had done nothing wrong, even though he had tried, really tried, to handle the situation the way his mother had taught him, his pulse still pounded against his skull. He had seen too many stories like this. He had heard too many warnings. And now, it was happening to him. The store door swung open with force, and two officers strode inside. One was older, with graying hair and a stiff posture. His uniform was pressed sharp, his badge shining under the store's bright lights. His name tag read Reynolds. The other officer was younger, maybe in his late 20s, with sharp eyes that flicked between Malik and Linda. Carter, his tag read. There he is. Linda cried, pointing at Malik like she had just spotted a wanted fugitive. That's him. He tried to steal from me. Officer Reynolds didn't hesitate. He took a step forward, his hand already moving toward his handcuffs. Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them. Malik's breath caught in his throat. The room tilted. Not again. Not like this. I didn't. Hands up, Reynolds said, his voice firm, unyielding. Malik could hear his mother's voice in his head, warning him, pleading with him. He raised his hands. Slowly. Carter, the younger officer, frowned. He looked between Malik and Linda, then at the bracelet, still sitting perfectly untouched on the counter. He hesitated. "Ma'am," he said, glancing at Linda. "Did you check the security footage?" Linda scoffed. "I don't need footage. I saw him." He dropped it because he was trying to put it in his pocket. Malik felt his stomach churn. That wasn't what happened. Carter hesitated again. Something wasn't sitting right with him. But Reynolds wasn't hesitating. He pulled out his cuffs. "That's enough," he said, stepping forward. "Turn around." Malik's whole body went rigid. His chest was too tight to breathe. He could see how this would play out. He had seen it before, on the news, in his own neighborhood. And just like that, the words burst out of him before he could stop them. "Call my mother." Reynolds stopped. Just for a second. "What?" Malik's voice was stronger now. "Call my mother," he repeated, holding Reynolds' gaze. "Now." Linda let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Oh sure, let's call Mommy," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's she going to do? Beg us to let you go?" Malik didn't respond. He just pulled his phone out of his pocket, slow and careful, and dialed the number he knew by heart. When the call connected, he only said 4 words. "Mom, I need you." Then he looked Reynolds dead in the eye. "You're going to want to listen to this." Because what none of them knew, not Linda, not Reynolds, not Carter, was that Malik's mother wasn't just any woman. She was Dr. Olivia Bennett. And she was about to change everything. Malik held the phone to his ear, his fingers tightening around the edges, his knuckles turning pale. His mother's voice had been calm on the line, steady, controlled, but he knew that meant nothing. He had heard that tone before, in moments when she was more furious than she let on. He could almost picture her right now, her sharp eyes narrowing, her jaw clenching as she processed what he had just told her. She had always told him to be careful, to be prepared, but she had also told him to call her if he ever felt that he needed her. And now he did. Linda let out a dry laugh from behind the counter. She didn't believe for a second that his mother could do anything to help him. She looked at him the way someone looks at a child pretending to be an adult, as if he were playing a game where the stakes weren't real. "Oh, this I gotta see," she muttered under her breath, her arms folding across her chest. Malik ignored her. He was done explaining himself to her. Reynolds, the older officer, was still holding the cuffs in his hand, still standing too close, still waiting for an excuse. And Malik knew how quickly that excuse could appear. A flinch, a wrong breath, a move too sudden, he had seen what happened in those moments. He wasn't about to let it happen to him. Reynolds exhaled sharply. "Look, kid, your mom's not going to." Then his radio crackled. There was a pause. "Dispatch?" Reynolds said, pressing a hand to his radio. The reply came through the static. "Sergeant, we have a request from Chief Bennett. She's en route to your location now." The store fell silent. The entire room shifted in an instant. Reynolds straightened, his shoulders tightening. Carter, the younger officer, blinked in surprise, his head tilting slightly. Linda's mouth fell open just a fraction, her smug expression cracking like thin ice under too much weight. "Chief Bennett?" Reynolds repeated, his voice changing just slightly, like he had misheard. Malik didn't say a word. He let that moment sink in. Let them sit in it. Linda's fingers twitched against the counter, and she finally found her voice. "Chief Bennett," she said, forcing out a laugh that didn't quite land. "What? Your mother works for the police?" Malik turned his head slightly, locking eyes with her. "She is the police," he said simply. Linda's face paled. Reynolds shifted on his feet, looking at Carter, then at Malik, then back at his radio like he wasn't quite sure what to do now. "Well," Linda said quickly, her voice gaining back some of its confidence. "I don't care who his mother is. He still tried to steal from me, and I..." "Did you see him take it?" Carter cut in suddenly. His voice wasn't loud, but it hit the room like a hammer against glass. Linda turned to him, startled. "Excuse me?" "You said he tried to steal from you," Carter continued, his gaze sharper than before. "So I'm asking, did you actually see him take the bracelet?" Linda hesitated. Malik caught it. Carter caught it. Even Reynolds caught it. Her mouth opened, closed. She wasn't expecting that question. Well, not exactly," she admitted finally. "But I saw it fall. He was handling it too much, and he must have. So he dropped it," Carter said. Linda flushed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You don't understand. I know when someone is trying to steal. I've been working here for 20 years, and I can tell." Carter cut her off again. "With all due respect, ma'am, it doesn't matter how long you've been working here. If you didn't actually see him take anything, then what exactly are we arresting him for?" Reynolds bristled at that. He didn't like the way Carter was questioning this, didn't like that the certainty of the situation was suddenly unraveling. Linda sputtered. "I told you what happened." "What? You don't believe me?" Malik could have answered for him. Because no, Carter didn't believe her. Not entirely. He wasn't like Reynolds, who had made up his mind before even stepping into the store. He was watching Malik, watching Linda, and for the first time since this had started, Malik saw something shift in the young officer's face. Doubt. A few seconds passed, stretching thick between them. Then the sound of heels clicking against tile filled the store. Steady. Sharp. A commanding presence entered the room, one that took up space without having to say a single word. Malik didn't even have to turn to know who it was. His mother had arrived. Dr. Olivia Bennett, chief of police, stood just inside the doorway. Her navy blue suit was crisp, her badge shining under the store's bright lights. She wasn't the tallest person in the room, but she might as well have been. She was the kind of woman who walked into a space and owned it without effort. And every single person in that store felt it. Linda's face drained of color. Carter stepped back instinctively, his posture straightening, his hands loosening at his sides. Reynolds was the only one who didn't fully react, but even he shifted, his jaw tightening. "Chief," he said stiffly. Olivia didn't acknowledge him right away. Instead, her sharp brown eyes swept across the room. She took everything in, the way Malik was standing, rigid and still, the way Linda's fingers gripped the counter, the way Carter's gaze was flicking between her and Reynolds, calculating. Then, slowly, she exhaled. "What," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the room like a blade, "is going on here?" No one answered at first. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked like someone desperately trying to find her footing in a conversation she no longer controlled. Reynolds finally cleared his throat. "Chief, we responded to a call about an attempted theft." Olivia's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Attempted theft," she repeated. "Yes," Reynolds said. "The store clerk reported." "Did you check the cameras?" Her words were sharp, interrupting him mid-sentence. Reynolds stopped. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't answer. And that told Olivia everything she needed to know. She exhaled again, slow and deliberate. Then she turned, finally, to Malik. For the first time since she had arrived, she really looked at him. And Malik felt something inside him break open. Because the way his mother looked at him, the way she saw him standing there, accused, humiliated, backed into a corner like an animal, he knew this moment shattered something inside of her, too. She took in his raised hands. The way his fingers curled slightly, not in fists, but in tension. The way he stood so still, like he knew even one wrong step could end everything. Her jaw clenched, but her voice was steady. "Baby," she said, "are you okay?" Malik's throat felt tight. He wanted to say yes, wanted to say no. Instead, all that came out was, "I didn't do anything." And that was all Olivia needed to hear. She turned back to Reynolds. "Sergeant," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "I suggest we check those cameras now." And just like that, the false accusation started to unravel. And Linda? She knew it. She knew it before anyone else did. Because for the first time since this had started, she stopped talking. And that silence? That silence spoke louder than any words ever could. The tension in the store had thickened, pressing against Malik like a weight on his chest. His mother, Chief Olivia Bennett, stood in front of him now, her presence cutting through the moment like a blade, but even with her there, the tight knot in his stomach refused to loosen. She had asked one simple question: had they checked the cameras? Sergeant Reynolds had hesitated. He hadn't expected the question, and he sure didn't like being asked it by his superior. Malik could see the muscle in the older officer's jaw twitch as he shifted uncomfortably. He still held the handcuffs in his hand, as if he wasn't ready to admit that he wouldn't be using them today. Officer Carter, standing just a few feet away, still hadn't moved, but Malik could tell his mind was working. He had already started to doubt the story. His posture wasn't rigid like Reynolds's, wasn't defensive. He was watching, waiting, trying to decide what the next right move was. Linda Baxter, the store clerk, stood behind the counter, gripping the edge as if it might somehow keep her grounded. She had lost her earlier smugness, but something in her eyes remained defiant. She still believed she could talk her way out of this. "I don't need the cameras to tell me what I saw," she finally said, lifting her chin. Olivia turned to her, her expression unreadable, her voice calm. "Then tell me what you saw." Linda blinked, but she recovered quickly. "I told you already." He picked up the bracelet, and then it fell. But he was handling it too much. "I know when someone's trying to pocket something. And besides, why would he be here if he wasn't looking for trouble?" The last sentence hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, like a slap Malik hadn't seen coming. Why would he be here? Because, to Linda, a young black man in a hoodie had no business walking into a place like this unless he was up to no good. Malik felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He forced himself to breathe, to keep his hands steady at his sides, to push back the anger swelling in his chest. His mother, though, didn't even flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. "You know when someone's trying to steal?" Olivia repeated. Linda nodded sharply. "Yes." "How?" Linda's mouth opened, then closed. She wasn't expecting that question. Well, you just know." "I see." Olivia nodded slowly. "And yet, as far as I can tell, you didn't actually see him attempt to take anything." Linda's cheeks flushed, and she straightened, gripping the counter even harder. "That's not the point," she said quickly. "I called the police because I had reason to believe he was stealing. I did my duty as a responsible citizen." Olivia studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Reynolds. "And you responded to that call," she said smoothly, "by walking in and immediately deciding my son was guilty." Reynolds bristled. "That's not. You had your handcuffs out before you even asked a single question," Olivia cut in, her voice still steady, still even. Reynolds's nostrils flared. "With all due respect, Chief, we were following protocol. The store called in a potential theft. We had every reason to assume." "To assume what?" Olivia's voice was soft, almost too soft, the kind of quiet that made people listen harder. "To assume that a 17-year-old boy was committing a crime before even checking the facts?" Reynolds squared his shoulders. He didn't like this. Didn't like being questioned, didn't like that the moment was slipping away from him. "We had to act quickly," he said stiffly. "You had to act quickly," Olivia repeated, nodding slightly as if she were considering his words. Then she took a slow step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. But what I want to know, Sergeant, she continued, her voice carrying a dangerous edge, is why acting quickly meant reaching for your cuffs instead of your radio. Why it meant escalating instead of evaluating. Why it meant immediately believing the person behind the counter instead of the person standing in front of you. Reynolds's face was a careful mask now, his mouth a thin line. He said nothing. Carter, standing beside him, looked more uneasy by the second. Malik's chest felt too tight. He had never seen his mother like this, not in a way that was meant for him, for his protection. She had been in 100 tense situations before, had faced down people far worse than Reynolds, but this was different. This was personal. And still, Reynolds refused to back down. We were called in to handle a crime, he said firmly. We handled it accordingly. Olivia's eyes flicked to Carter. Handled it accordingly, she repeated. Tell me, Officer Carter, did you feel this situation was handled accordingly? Carter hesitated. He had been quiet for too long, thinking, watching. And now Olivia was asking him directly, and he knew he couldn't dodge it. He cleared his throat. I think we should have checked the security footage first, he admitted carefully. Reynolds' head snapped toward him. Carter. No, Olivia said sharply, cutting off whatever reprimand Reynolds was about to throw. Let him speak. Carter glanced at Reynolds once more, then turned back to Olivia. I think, he said slowly, carefully, that we may have acted too fast. Reynolds tensed, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Malik watched, barely breathing. Linda, for the first time, looked like she might actually be nervous. Olivia nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. That's what I thought. The room was so quiet now, Malik could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Then Olivia turned to the store manager, a man who had been standing stiffly near the back, too afraid or too unwilling to step in. You, she said. The man straightened, looking like he wanted to disappear. Yes, ma'am. Show me the footage. He nodded quickly, turning toward the small monitor behind the counter. He moved with speed and precision, eager to remove himself from the crossfire. Linda's fingers twitched on the counter. Reynolds shifted, his jaw tightening. Carter exhaled quietly. Malik didn't move. Seconds later, the footage began to play. The moment filled the screen, the bracelet slipping from his hands, falling, hitting the glass counter before bouncing onto the floor. The store fell into absolute silence. No theft. No pocketing. No crime. Just a 17-year-old who had been excited to buy a gift for his sister. A boy who had saved for months just to make someone he loved happy. A boy who had been accused before anyone even looked at the truth. Malik swallowed hard, his throat suddenly thick. His mother stood still for a long moment, watching the replay, her face unreadable. Then, finally, she turned back to Reynolds. Well, Sergeant, she said, her voice smooth but sharp as glass, what happens now? Reynolds said nothing. He didn't have an answer. Carter looked away. Linda opened her mouth, desperate to find something, anything, to say, but Olivia held up a hand, silencing her before she even got a word out. I don't want to hear it, she said coldly. I saw what I needed to see. Then, slowly, she exhaled and turned back to Malik. Let's go, baby, she murmured. Malik felt his shoulders sag, like he had been holding up something far too heavy for far too long. He nodded, stepping forward. His mother placed a steady hand on his back, guiding him toward the door. As they passed Reynolds, Malik met his gaze one last time. Reynolds looked angry. Not at what had happened, but at the fact that he had been wrong. Malik let out a slow breath. And then, for the first time since he had walked into the store, he finally walked out. Malik could still hear the words echoing in his head. What happens now? His mother had said it with such steady confidence, such unwavering control, that for a brief moment, Malik had felt the weight of the moment shift in his favor. But even with the security footage proving his innocence, even with Linda's accusation unraveling in front of everyone, his heart was still hammering in his chest. He had almost been arrested. For nothing. For an accident. For walking into a store with money in his pocket, ready to buy a gift for his little sister. And if his mother hadn't answered his call, if she hadn't been who she was, what would have happened? Malik didn't want to think about it, but he couldn't stop. His mother's hand on his back was firm but gentle as they stepped outside, leaving behind the heavy, suffocating air of the jewelry store. The sun was still shining, the world outside moving along like nothing had happened. People walked past them on the sidewalk, chatting, checking their phones, sipping coffee from the shop down the street. None of them knew that inside that store, Malik had just come too close to being another story. He exhaled shakily, rubbing a hand over his face. His mother said nothing, but she was watching him. He could feel it. She always knew when something was wrong. When they reached her car, she stopped, turning to him fully. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer now. It wasn't Chief Bennett asking. It was his mother. Malik let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know." His mother steadied him, then sighed, leaning against the car, her arms crossing over her chest. "I was in a meeting when you called," she said after a moment. "Barely heard my phone buzzing. But I saw your name, and I knew something was wrong." Malik looked down at the sidewalk, kicking at a small pebble. "I almost didn't call." His mother's head tilted slightly. "Why not?" He exhaled, shaking his head again. "Because I shouldn't have had to." The words came out raw, jagged, scraping against his throat as he spoke them. He shouldn't have needed her to come in and fix things. He shouldn't have needed his mother's badge, her authority, just to make sure he walked out of that store instead of being shoved into a police car. His mother let the words sit between them for a moment before speaking again. "You're right," she said quietly. Malik's head snapped up. She never said that. She always found a way to make it a lesson, to remind him to be careful, to tell him that the world wasn't fair but that he had to find ways to survive it anyway. But now, she just stood there, acknowledging the simple, painful truth. He shouldn't have had to call. And yet, he had. And it had made all the difference. His mother reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts, before pressing one and lifting the device to her ear. Malik frowned. "Who are you calling?" She didn't answer right away. Then, as the line connected, she spoke. "Cynthia," she said, her voice shifting slightly, still calm, still smooth, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "I need a press release prepared immediately." Malik's heart skipped a beat. He knew that name. Cynthia Clark, the head of the police department's public relations office. This wasn't just going to go away. His mother wasn't going to let it. "Yes," Olivia continued, glancing at Malik as she spoke. "Regarding Baxter Jewelers." She paused, listening, then nodded. "I want a full investigation into the call that was made to dispatch. I also want an internal review of Sergeant Reynolds and Officer Carter." Reynolds. Hearing the name made Malik's stomach twist. Reynolds, who had been ready to slap cuffs on him without a second thought. Reynolds, who had only started hesitating when Olivia walked through the door. His mother wasn't finished. "And make sure the media knows exactly what happened today," she said, her voice sharpening just slightly. "No, I don't want it softened. I want it as it happened. Make sure it includes Linda Baxter's name, as well as her direct accusations against an innocent customer." If she thought she could do this without consequences, she was mistaken. Malik stared at her. The moment she hung up, he shook his head. "Mom," he murmured, his voice hesitant. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She slid her phone back into her purse, then turned to him. "Listen to me," she said, and he did. He always did. "You think this is just about you?" Malik frowned, unsure what she meant. "I was able to get to you in time," she continued. "I was able to stop it. But how many other kids do you think have been in that same store, accused the same way, and didn't have someone to call? Malik swallowed hard. Too many. He knew that. His mother had seen it over and over again. This isn't just about what happened today, she said. This is about making sure it doesn't happen to someone else tomorrow. Malik let out a slow breath, nodding. She was right. She always was. The moment stretched between them, filled with something heavy, something unfinished. Then, suddenly, Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Maya. His little sister. He hesitated, then answered. Hey, Maya. Malik. Are you still out? Did you get it? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He could hear the excitement in her voice, the hope. He hadn't gotten it. After everything that had happened, he couldn't go back in there. But before he could figure out what to say, his mother reached into her purse, pulling something out. A small, navy blue jewelry box. Malik's eyes widened. His mother smirked. You think I was just going to let them get away with this and ruin Maya's birthday? A slow smile crept onto his face. He shook his head, chuckling. Of course not. She had bought the bracelet herself. He lifted the phone back to his ear. Yeah, Maya, he said, his voice warmer now. I got it. She squealed on the other end, making him pull the phone slightly away from his ear. This is the best birthday ever, she gushed. I can't wait to see it. I love you, Malik. He felt something tighten in his chest, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was love. I love you too, Maya, he murmured. As he ended the call, his mother placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. We good? She asked. Malik exhaled. He thought about the fear in that store, about the accusation, about the way Reynolds had looked at him like he already knew exactly who he was, without ever actually knowing him at all. Then he thought about his mother. About Maya. About what came next. He nodded. Yeah, he said. We're good. And for the first time since he had walked into that store, he actually believed it. The moment Olivia Bennett stepped through the doors of Baxter Jewelers, the air in the store seemed to shift. She wasn't loud. She wasn't aggressive. She didn't need to be. Her presence alone was enough. The kind of presence that commanded attention, the kind that made people sit up a little straighter, choose their words more carefully. And in that moment, everyone in the store knew, whether they admitted it or not, that the situation had just changed. Malik stood frozen in place, his breath shallow, his heart still racing from the fear that had gripped him only moments ago. But when his mother's gaze met his, he felt something solid beneath his feet again. He had called her. And she had come. Linda Baxter, the store clerk, was the first to react. She didn't look relieved to see Olivia. If anything, she looked shaken, though she was doing her best to cover it up. Chief Bennett, Linda said, forcing a tight, polite smile. Olivia didn't even look at her. Her focus was on her son. Her sharp brown eyes scanned him quickly, checking for anything out of place, any sign that he had been harmed, any trace of fear that might still linger in his expression. Malik swallowed hard. He saw it in her eyes, the silent anger simmering just beneath her controlled surface. The kind of anger that only came when someone you loved had been hurt. Finally, she turned. Her gaze landed on Sergeant Reynolds. Sergeant, she said, her voice even, controlled. Reynolds, who had been so sure of himself just moments ago, stiffened. Chief, he said, clearing his throat. Walk me through exactly what happened here. The words were calm, but there was no mistaking the command in them. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Officer Carter, as if hoping his younger colleague might jump in to share the weight of the explanation. But Carter didn't move. He looked just as unsure as before. Reynolds exhaled sharply. We received a call from the store reporting an attempted theft, he said. We responded accordingly. Olivia tilted her head. Accordingly, she repeated. And what does accordingly mean, exactly? Reynolds' jaw tightened. We arrived on the scene, identified the suspect, and were in the process of detaining him when you arrived. Malik's stomach turned at that word. Suspect. Like he had walked into that store with a plan to commit a crime. Like he had done something other than try to buy a gift for his sister. Olivia nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. And at what point, she continued, her voice softer now, more dangerous, did you check the security footage? Reynolds paused. The answer was written all over his face before he even opened his mouth. We were about to. You were about to arrest my son, Olivia interrupted smoothly, before reviewing a single piece of evidence. Reynolds bristled. With all due respect, Chief, we were responding to the store clerk's report. We acted based on her account of the situation. Olivia turned, her gaze settling on Linda. The woman stiffened, but she lifted her chin, still clinging to the confidence she had started with. He was handling the bracelet too much, Linda said quickly. And then he dropped it. I could tell he was trying to pocket it before I caught him. Malik clenched his jaw. He wanted to shout. Wanted to ask her again and again how she could lie so easily, how she could look him in the eye and say these things when the truth was right there on the security tape. But he didn't need to say anything. Because his mother was already tearing through Linda's story, piece by piece. And you didn't see him try to put the bracelet in his pocket? Olivia asked, her voice still maddeningly calm. Linda hesitated for a fraction of a second, so brief that most people might have missed it. But Olivia didn't miss anything. No, Linda admitted quickly. But I knew what he was trying to do. I've been working in retail for years. I know when someone's up to no good. The words hung in the air like an iron weight. I know when someone's up to no good. Malik felt his mother's energy shift beside him. It was subtle, but he knew her well enough to feel it. She knew exactly what Linda meant. Knew exactly why she had jumped to conclusions the moment Malik walked into the store. You know when someone's up to no good, Olivia repeated, her voice quieter now, but no less powerful. Linda's fingers twitched. Malik could see her realization setting in. She had said too much. Olivia turned back to Reynolds. So, Sergeant, she said, tilting her head slightly. You took the word of a store clerk, detained a teenager, and nearly arrested him, all without a single piece of actual evidence. Reynolds shifted on his feet. His entire body was tense now, like a rope pulled too tight. We were following protocol, he muttered, his voice clipped. Protocol? Olivia repeated. Tell me, Sergeant, what exact protocol tells you to believe a single person's assumption over a review of the facts? Reynolds' face darkened. He had no answer. Olivia let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable before she turned to Carter. Officer Carter, she said. The younger officer straightened instinctively. Yes, ma'am. Do you believe this situation was handled appropriately? Carter hesitated. And in that hesitation, Malik saw something else. Regret. Carter cleared his throat. I believe we should have checked the security footage first. Reynolds shot him a sharp look, but Carter kept his gaze steady. Linda, who had been holding on to whatever dignity she had left, let out an exasperated scoff. I told you what happened, she snapped. You saw how he was acting. You saw the way he... Enough, Olivia said. Her voice wasn't loud. But the room went silent instantly. Linda clamped her mouth shut, her expression twisting with something close to panic. Because in that moment, she knew. She had lost. Olivia took a slow breath. Then she turned to the store manager, the man who had stood by, saying nothing, letting all of this unfold without a word. You, she said smoothly. The man jerked upright. Yes, ma'am. Show me the footage. The man didn't hesitate. Seconds later, the screen behind the counter flickered to life. And there it was. The moment the bracelet slipped from Malik's fingers. The way he reached to pick it up, startled but careful. The way Linda's face twisted the moment she saw him, the way she leapt to conclusions before a single word had even left his mouth. The silence that followed was so thick it was suffocating. Malik swallowed hard. He had known what the footage would show. He had lived it. But seeing it play out on screen, watching his own innocence unfold in front of them all, it still felt like something inside him had cracked open. Carter let out a slow breath. Reynolds' face was unreadable, but his posture had changed. And Linda? She looked away from the screen entirely. Because now, the truth was out. And there was no talking her way out of this. Olivia took one final breath. Then, turning to Reynolds, she said, "Well, Sergeant, I believe you have a decision to make." The store was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the security monitor, still playing the footage that told the truth better than any argument ever could. Malik had watched it unfold in real time. He had felt every moment of it. And yet, standing there, watching himself on the screen, his own hands, careful and deliberate, picking up the bracelet, examining it with admiration, the way it had slipped and tumbled to the floor, it almost felt like he was seeing someone else. Because the boy on that screen wasn't a thief. He was just a kid. A kid who had walked into a store with money in his pocket and a simple hope to make his little sister smile. Linda Baxter, the store clerk, had fallen quiet now. She stood behind the counter, staring at the screen with tight lips and a clenched jaw, but she wasn't really looking at it. Because looking at it meant acknowledging that she had been wrong. And people like her, people who carried the weight of their own assumptions like a shield, never liked to admit they were wrong. Malik swallowed hard, his throat dry. He turned slightly, glancing at his mother. Olivia Bennett stood with her arms folded, her face unreadable. She wasn't angry. No, anger would have been too easy. She was something else. Something heavier. Disappointed. Sergeant Reynolds exhaled sharply, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't looking at the screen either. Instead, he was staring at the floor, his mouth pressed into a hard, thin line. He knew. He had known the moment Olivia walked in that something had gone wrong, but now that the evidence was there, in black and white, he couldn't deny it anymore. Officer Carter was the first to break the silence. He took a slow step forward, adjusting the belt on his uniform, glancing between Malik and the screen before clearing his throat. "Well," he murmured, his voice careful, "it looks like we may have misread the situation." Malik almost laughed out loud. Misread? They had nearly arrested him. His mother didn't react at first. Then, slowly, she turned her head and gave Carter a look that made the young officer take a half step back. "You misread the situation," she said, her voice so quiet, so controlled, that it somehow carried more weight than if she had shouted it. Carter shifted uncomfortably, but before he could say anything else, Reynolds let out another heavy sigh. "Chief," he started, still not meeting Olivia's eyes. "No," Olivia said, shaking her head. "Don't talk to me." Reynolds froze. "You want to explain yourself?" she continued, taking a slow step forward. "You don't explain it to me. You explain it to him." She gestured toward Malik. Malik felt a jolt in his chest. Reynolds stiffened, looking at him now, really looking at him, for what felt like the first time since all of this started. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Then, after a long moment, he said, "I made a mistake." The words hung in the air, awkward and forced, like they had been pulled out of him with a pair of pliers. It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was something. Malik held his gaze for a long second, then nodded slowly. Not because he forgave him. Not because the words meant anything. But because he refused to let Reynolds take any more of his time. His mother exhaled sharply and turned to Linda. "And you?" she asked. Linda bristled, her fingers gripping the counter, her knuckles turning pale. "I did what I thought was right," she said, her voice clipped. "I thought." "You thought," Olivia interrupted, her eyes flashing. "You thought. And because you thought, my son was nearly handcuffed in the middle of your store for doing nothing at all." Linda swallowed hard, but she didn't say sorry. She wasn't going to. Malik could see it. She wasn't the type. Instead, she let out a sharp breath and looked at Reynolds. "I'd like him removed from my store." For a moment, the words didn't even register. Then Malik's jaw tightened. Removed? After all of this? After she had been wrong? Reynolds hesitated, glancing at Olivia, as if asking her permission. She scoffed, shaking her head. "Oh, don't look at me." Then she turned to Malik. "What do you want to do, baby?" Malik blinked at her. The way she said it, so casual, so simple, like he had a choice now. He could leave. Walk out of that store, away from the tension, away from the stares. Or he could stay. Stay, just because he had every right to be there. Stay, because he wasn't going to let Linda erase him from a place he had never done anything wrong in. Malik looked at the bracelet, still sitting in the case. The bracelet he had come in here to buy. The gift for his sister, the reason he had walked through those doors in the first place. He turned back to Linda. "I'll take the bracelet," he said. Linda's face twisted, like she had just bitten into something sour. "Excuse me?" "I'll take the bracelet," Malik repeated. He pulled out his wallet, the same wallet Linda had doubted, and set the exact amount on the counter. For a second, she didn't move. Then, stiffly, she picked up the money, counted it, and slid the bracelet into a box. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed it toward him. Malik picked it up and held it for a moment. Then he looked her in the eyes. "I came in here to buy something for my sister," he said, his voice steady. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I never did anything to you. I never tried to steal from you. And you know that now." Linda's mouth pressed into a thin line. But still, no apology. Malik nodded to himself, pocketed the box, and turned away. As he walked toward the door, his mother beside him, he could feel all of their eyes on him. Reynolds, Carter, Linda. The customers who had stood there watching everything unfold, saying nothing. But Malik didn't look back. The heavy glass door swung open, the warm afternoon air hitting his face. And as they stepped outside, Malik breathed again for the first time in what felt like hours. His mother glanced at him as they walked to her car. "You okay?" she asked. He exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She studied him for a second longer, then reached into her pocket and handed him the keys. "Drive," she said. Malik's brows lifted. "Really?" Olivia smirked. "You've had a hell of a day." Malik let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head, then climbed into the driver's seat. As he pulled onto the street, the box sat in his lap, the silver bracelet resting safely inside. He had come in to buy a gift for Maya. And he was going to give it to her. No one, not Linda, not Reynolds, not anyone in that store, had taken that away from him. Not today. Not ever. The drive home was quiet. Not the kind of silence that was uncomfortable, but the kind that sat heavy, filling the space between them like something unsaid but understood. Malik kept his hand steady on the wheel, his fingers gripping it a little tighter than usual. His mother sat beside him, her gaze fixed out the window, but he knew her mind was working, turning over everything that had just happened, every word spoken, every action taken. Malik's eyes flicked to the small navy blue box resting in his lap at the red light. The bracelet was inside, safely tucked away, the very thing he had walked into that store for in the first place. He should have felt victorious. He had gotten what he came for. He had proven his innocence. But why didn't it feel like a win? His mother sighed beside him. "You're thinking too hard." Malik let out a dry chuckle. Can't help it. She turned to look at him, studying his face like she always did when she wanted to read what he wasn't saying. You're wondering why it still feels heavy, she said, as if pulling the thought right out of his mind. He nodded, his fingers tapping against the wheel. Yeah. She exhaled, shifting in her seat. Because proving you were innocent shouldn't have been something you had to do. Malik swallowed hard. There it was. It wasn't about the bracelet. It wasn't even about Linda Baxter. It was about the fact that none of this should have happened at all. You could have had a badge, he muttered, shaking his head. A lawyer standing next to me. A judge. It wouldn't have mattered to her. No, it wouldn't have, his mother agreed. Malik clenched his jaw. And if you weren't Chief Bennett. I know, Olivia said softly. That was the part that stung the most. He had been saved not because the truth had come out in time, but because he had someone powerful enough to demand that the truth be heard. How many others never got that chance? The thought settled deep in his chest, making it harder to breathe. His mother reached for her phone again, scrolling through her contacts. Malik didn't have to ask who she was calling this time. Cynthia. The head of public relations for the police department. The person responsible for making sure that when injustice happened, it didn't go unanswered. She put the phone to her ear, her voice sharp and clear when the line picked up. Cynthia, I want a statement drafted immediately. Malik listened as she laid it out, every detail of what had happened, every misstep, every decision that had nearly led to her son being treated like a criminal for simply existing in a space that others thought he didn't belong in. I want an internal review of Sergeant Reynolds, she continued. And Officer Carter, too. I want to know exactly how that call was handled from the moment it came in. Dispatch logs. Body cam footage. The works. There was a pause, then she nodded. No, I don't want it quiet. I want it public. I want it handled the same way it would be if the roles were reversed. And Cynthia. Malik heard the slight shift in her voice, the firmness beneath the professionalism. Make sure the store's name is in the statement. And make sure Linda Baxter's name is in it too. She ended the call. Malik exhaled, gripping the wheel a little tighter. You're really going after them. His mother turned her head toward him, her brows slightly raised. You think I'm just going to let this go? He shook his head. No, but... She waited. Malik sighed, glancing at her. Do you think it'll matter? She considered him for a moment before answering. It'll matter to the next kid who walks into that store and doesn't get accused of stealing just for breathing in the wrong place. He nodded slowly. That was what mattered, wasn't it? Not just what happened today, but what wouldn't happen tomorrow because of it. By the time they pulled into the driveway, the weight in his chest had lessened, not gone, but lighter. Maya was waiting at the door. The second she saw Malik step out of the car, she practically bounced in place, her excitement bubbling over. You got it, she called, already running toward him. Malik smiled despite himself, holding up the small box. Yeah, I got it. Maya let out a happy squeal, launching herself at him in a tight hug before pulling back and eagerly grabbing the box. She opened it, her eyes going wide. Oh wow, she breathed. It's even prettier in person. Malik watched her carefully as she took the bracelet out, holding it up to the sunlight, the silver charms catching the light. She turned it over in her hands, then glanced up at him. You okay? Malik hesitated. But then he nodded. Yeah. She studied him for a second longer, the way little sisters always do, before nodding once like she had decided to believe him. She held out her wrist. Help me put it on? Malik took the bracelet, fastening it around her wrist carefully. As he did, he thought about everything it had taken to get here, every second of fear, every judgmental look, every assumption thrown his way. And yet, standing here, watching the way Maya's face lit up with joy, Malik knew one thing for sure. This moment was worth it. And no one, not Linda Baxter, not Sergeant Reynolds, not anyone, could take that from him. Not now. Not ever. That night, Malik sat on the edge of his bed, the bracelet's empty box still in his hands. The room was dimly lit, just his bedside lamp casting a warm glow across the walls. The rest of the house was quiet, his mother in her office finishing paperwork, Maya already asleep, the bracelet now resting safely on her wrist. It should have been a good ending. It should have felt like victory. But all Malik could think about was how close it had been to something else entirely. His fingers ran over the smooth lid of the box, his mind replaying the moment over and over again, the sound of the bracelet hitting the glass counter, the way Linda's face had twisted, the sharp finality in her voice as she called for the police, certain of what she thought she knew. The weight of those words, the accusation, still sat heavy in his chest. If his mother hadn't answered his call, if she hadn't been who she was, if there had been no cameras. He thought about it because he knew the answer. He had seen too many names on the news. Too many faces. It wasn't enough to be innocent. Innocence didn't stop handcuffs from being snapped around wrists. It didn't stop people from believing a lie the moment it was told. Malik let out a slow breath and stared at the ceiling. He had walked into that store excited, hopeful, thinking about how much Maya would love the bracelet. And within minutes, he had been reduced to nothing more than a threat in their eyes. Because he was black. Because he was young. Because he had stepped into a space that people like Linda thought wasn't for him. It didn't matter that he had worked hard for the money in his pocket. It didn't matter that he had spoken respectfully, stood still, done everything right. She had looked at him and decided she already knew his story. And the worst part? Everyone had believed her. The customers. The officers. They had all stood there, watching, saying nothing. He wondered how many of them had gone home tonight, told their families about the almost thief at Baxter Jewelers, never bothering to learn what really happened. It didn't sit right with him. He could still see Sergeant Reynolds' face, the way his expression had shifted when the truth had come out. It wasn't guilt. Not really. It was frustration, not because he had almost arrested an innocent kid, but because he had been forced to admit he was wrong. And Linda? She hadn't apologized. She had just stood there, her face tight with anger, still convinced she was right in some way, even when the proof was staring her in the face. That was what really stuck with Malik. Not just the way people saw him, but the way they refused to see him differently, even when the truth was right in front of them. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His mother stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Malik sighed. "Not really." She sat down next to him, her sharp eyes searching his face. "Talk to me." He hesitated, rolling the box between his hands. I keep thinking about how different today could have gone." Olivia was silent for a moment, letting him find his words. "I mean, it's over, right? The cameras proved what happened. The statement is being put out. It should feel done." He exhaled sharply. "But it doesn't." His mother nodded slowly. "Because it's not just about today." Malik swallowed hard. "No." She shifted, turning toward him fully. "Do you know what I thought about when I was driving to the store?" He shook his head. "I thought about my father," she said quietly. "Your grandfather." Malik frowned. "Granddad?" She nodded. "He used to tell me stories about his childhood. About how, when he was your age, he wasn't even allowed inside stores like that. And if he had been accused of stealing, he wouldn't have walked out at all." Malik's stomach twisted. He had heard some of his grandfather's stories before, but never from his mother. She sighed. "When I saw your name on my phone, I thought about that. About how much has changed. And about how much hasn't." Malik felt a lump rise in his throat. "Baby," his mother said, her voice softer now, "you can do everything right, and sometimes it still won't be enough. Not because of who you are, but because of who people expect you to be. Malik looked down at the box in his hands. That's what scares me, he admitted. His mother nodded. I know. He let out another breath, shaking his head. I shouldn't have had to prove I wasn't a criminal. No, you shouldn't have. Malik closed his eyes briefly, rubbing his forehead. But you did, she added. And you made sure they couldn't ignore it. Malik let her words settle over him. His mother wasn't the type to tell him things were okay when they weren't. But she always reminded him that even in a world stacked against him, he still had power. Not the kind that came from a badge, but the kind that came from knowing who he was, even when others tried to tell him otherwise. I want you to remember something, she said after a moment. Malik looked at her. There will always be people like Linda Baxter, she said. People who see what they want to see, no matter what's right in front of them. Malik nodded. He had learned that today. But, she continued, there will also be people like Officer Carter. Malik blinked. He hadn't thought about Carter much since they left the store. He hesitated, his mother said. He questioned what was happening, even when Reynolds was sure. She tilted her head. It wasn't much. But it was something. Malik sat with that for a moment. It wasn't enough. But it was something. Maybe Carter would think about today. Maybe, the next time he was in a situation like that, he wouldn't hesitate, he'd act. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. Change is slow, baby. But you're part of it now. Malik swallowed past the lump in his throat. He thought about Maya's face when she had opened the bracelet, the joy in her eyes, the way she had hugged him so tightly. He thought about what his mother had done to hold people accountable, making sure that the next boy like him wouldn't have to fight the same battle alone. He thought about his grandfather, walking past stores he wasn't allowed inside, and about how today, Malik had walked in and walked out on his own terms. The weight in his chest didn't disappear. But maybe, just maybe, it felt a little lighter. 3 days had passed. 3 days since Malik had walked out of that store with the bracelet. 3 days since the police had been forced to admit they had made a mistake. 3 days since Linda Baxter had been proven wrong. And yet, even with time, the weight of it all still lingered. Malik sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, watching as the story spread. It was everywhere now, local news stations, social media, online articles. His mother's press release had made sure of that. The headlines told the story in different ways. Black teen falsely accused of theft at Baxter Jewelers. Chief of police exposes racial profiling incident at local store. Justice for Malik Carter, a community reacts. Justice. Malik exhaled slowly. Was that what this was? Because if it was, it sure didn't feel the way he thought it would. He had spent his whole life hearing about cases like this. Cases where people who looked like him were accused of things they didn't do. Cases where the outcome could have been much worse. Now, his own face was in those stories. People were commenting, sharing their thoughts, their outrage. Some were defending him, saying what happened was wrong. Others were dismissing it, calling it an overreaction, saying the store had the right to be cautious. And then there were the ones that cut the deepest. If he hadn't been acting suspicious, this wouldn't have happened. Typical. Always playing the victim. His mom pulled rank. He got special treatment. That's the real injustice. Malik clenched his jaw and put his phone down. He had known people would talk. That was what happened when things like this went public. But knowing didn't make it easier. Footsteps approached, and then his mother sat beside him on the couch, placing a cup of tea in front of him. "You're thinking too hard again," she said. Malik let out a breath. "I keep seeing the comments." His mother sighed, rubbing a hand over her forehead. "Don't waste your energy on them." "I know," he muttered. But he did care. Maybe too much. He looked at her. Why are people so quick to defend what happened? She studied him for a moment before answering. Because it's easier to pretend something isn't a problem than to admit it is, she said simply. Malik swallowed. But they saw the footage. His mother tilted her head. Did Linda? That stopped him. He thought back to that moment when the truth had been played in front of everyone. How Linda had refused to look at the screen. How she had kept her back straight, her jaw tight, her arms crossed, never once admitting she had been wrong. It's the same thing, his mother continued. People who refuse to see the truth will always find a way to ignore it. Malik's fingers tapped against his knee. So what's the point? He asked, his voice tight. If people are always going to think what they want, if they're always going to make excuses, then what's the point of fighting it? Olivia sighed. Baby, the point isn't to change everyone. Some people will never change, no matter how much proof you give them. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. The point is to make sure they don't win. Malik sat with that. It didn't erase his frustration. Didn't undo what had happened. But it made sense. The article on his phone was proof of that. The headlines, the conversations, people were talking about it. The right people were listening. And that mattered. His mother squeezed his hand again. Come with me. Malik frowned. Where? You'll see. He sighed but got up, following her out the door. The air was crisp, a cool breeze cutting through the late afternoon sun. Olivia led him down the street, past the small cafe, past the bookstore, until they reached a familiar corner. Malik's stomach tightened. Baxter Jewelers. His mother stopped in front of it, arms crossed as she looked through the window. The store was open. But something was different. The usual steady stream of customers was gone. The bright, welcoming glow inside felt duller. Malik glanced at his mother. Why are we here? She tilted her head toward a sign posted on the door. Store under temporary management. Malik's breath hitched. She's gone, he asked. His mother nodded. Fired. He stared at the sign. He had wanted accountability. And here it was. Linda Baxter had lied, had tried to justify it, and now, for the first time, she was the one facing the consequences. It didn't fix everything. But it was something. His mother spoke again. You wanted to know if it would matter? Malik swallowed, still looking at the sign. Yeah. This is your answer. He exhaled, stepping back from the window. She was right. It mattered. Not in the way he had expected. Not in the way that fixed the world overnight. But it mattered. As they walked back home, Malik felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time, he knew. The fight wasn't over. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Life teaches us many lessons, but some are harder than others. The way people see us isn't always fair, and sometimes, no matter what we do, their assumptions speak louder than the truth. But that doesn't mean we stop standing up for ourselves. This story reminds us that justice isn't just about proving innocence, it's about holding people accountable, making sure mistakes don't become patterns, and creating a world where the next person doesn't have to fight the same battle. It's about using our voices, even when it feels like no one wants to listen. For those who have faced prejudice, the lesson is this: you are not alone. Your story matters. And for those who have the power to stand up for others, the lesson is just as important. If you see injustice, don't stay silent. Speak up. Do what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Every small step toward fairness makes a difference. Every conversation that challenges an assumption, every moment of truth that replaces a lie, it all adds up. We may not change everyone's mind, but we can change what's acceptable. And sometimes, that's enough to change the world.